space. So for many of us who are treading this new territory, we're having to reevaluate the way that we work, but also it's testing us not only sort of academically or kind of on a work basis, but also psychologically. And that's the angle that I'm going to be talking about today. So for those who've not worked in a environment like working from home, it's readjusting and relearning or unlearning ways that we have traditionally worked and learning new ways of working within a space that we would always see as a rest place or a place where we can relax. So for many of us, that's been probably the biggest struggle. And a lot of psychological research talks about how environment does dictate our ability to learn. There was a study years ago which talked about how we can have cues around us which can help us to memorize things or help us to learn things. Now, if those parts of those environment are there when we need it for recall, it enhances our ability to remember things. So this environment is hugely, hugely important. So for many of us, like I said before, if we're used to relaxing and, you know, kind of being in our kind of social space at home, to be able to get into a space of studying or focus or kind of creativity where we're expected to produce stuff, that's quite hard. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about. And the other issue is, I guess this pandemic has made us realize that there are so many things out of our control. And for many of us, working in these conditions is out of our control. It may not be our first choice. So this is, again, a shift that we're having to learn to accept and adapt to. Can I have the next slide? I wanted to talk about introversion and extroversion, get my teeth in and speak correctly. And as we know that we can be anywhere along this spectrum, you know, for many people who like to be in the presence of other people, who get energized by being around other people, I would probably class them as more extrovert, and that they feel like their batteries are charged when they are with other people. That's where I would see that, you know, that's where extroversion usually lies. But we can kind of, you know, move between those spaces. And then we've got our introverts. And our introverts actually find those social spaces hugely depleting. So it takes away our energy. We find those situations quite overwhelming. We can manage them from time to time, but actually we need our own time and space to recharge. So that's one thing that we need to be mindful of, is actually being in our own spaces. How are we finding it? Are we finding that actually we feel more settled in ourselves? Or are we feeling like we need that energy, that charge by being surrounded by other people? And again, it's about noticing when we feel depleted or when we feel energized, and knowing what we need to be calling upon during those times. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. So each of us are going to have individual ways of coping with these situations, depending on kind of our traits or our states. And often, I guess, what we forget is the positive and the negative around being in a work environment or an academic environment, like a school environment or a university or college environment, that these spaces are designed specifically for education, learning, productivity. But also, let's not forget the social aspect of being in these spaces. For many students, you know, not only is that space for academic learning, but it's also a space where they learn social skills on how to negotiate and how to learn to make friends or manage conflict. And then as we become adults, we're doing that in the work environment as well. We're negotiating conversations, we're trying to handle conflict, you know, we're trying to get our needs met in different ways. And actually that fulfills us on a social level as well. And that, you know, we forget the importance of that, being in these specific environments, which can help us to develop our emotional intelligence, I guess, in many ways. So some might find this shift to working from home quite difficult, and others actually might be like, yes, this is brilliant, finally I can kind of be in my own space. I don't have to, you know, constantly be bombarded by people's interruptions or conversations, and also, you know, not having long commutes. for some people, that can be quite difficult. And for others, it can be quite refreshing to have that kind of difference, I guess, in many ways. Next slide, please. So I guess the other thing that I wanted to mention is that as much as we, the introverts who are on this particular spectrum, they also do need connection. I think that's a fundamental human need, and we can't ignore that for those people who I've worked with as a psychologist have really struggled with the lack of connection with other people. So we, as much as we think that not being in the work environment or the school environment has been helpful, they've actually missed that social connection to people and being in spaces where people exist. So as much as it is a good thing, it actually does have a negative impact. It increases our sense of isolation and loneliness, which we know then could lead to mental health difficulties such as depression or low mood. So another thing that we need to be mindful of is the shift between real life in connection or interaction versus this virtual conference, kind of visual way of interacting. We probably are experiencing more email communication, more screen time. And this then leads to often the lack of nuance, the lack of kind of, the gentle interpretation that we might have when we're in the company of somebody. Let's not forget that actually, a high percentage between, I think it's 70 to 80% of communication is actually non-verbal. So what does that mean? That means that most of our body and our face does a lot of the communication. And as human beings, we're very good at reading other people. So when that's missing, and that's usually done by email or kind of by video conferencing, where you might not have the greatest internet connection, a lot of that stuff might be missed, which may cause problems in communication. So we have to be very mindful of how that is done. And I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about Zoom fatigue or video conferencing fatigue a little bit later, where we need to pay attention to that and how that actually does have a psychological impact on us. So the other things that we need to be thinking about is, what about the people who have never worked from home and all of a sudden they're being forced to be, working from home? They need to set up a desk. They need to have an ergonomic space where they can work properly. So can they reach things easily? Do they have a desk? Many people in the UK, don't normally typically work from home. And, a lot of businesses have struggled to meet the demands to make sure that their employees are carefully cared for during this time. So, some people might have back problems, some people may have eyesight problems. So actually it is the employer's responsibility to make sure that the health and safety risk assessment is done so that their health is not further detrimented as a result of changing the way their working environment is. So we've got to make sure we've got the correct equipment, making sure that our laptops are at a specific height, we've got the right chair, making sure the space is right. And we have to bear in mind that not everybody is going to have that. Some of us live in very tight, small spaces. And how's that going to make us feel working, living, eating in the same environments that we're constantly being, expected to be in? We know that that's not ideal, but sadly, this is the state of affairs that, many people are finding themselves, which again is having an impact on their sense of well-being. The other thing that we need to think about, I guess, is, next slide. Sorry, I've covered that. Zoom fatigue. Let's go to that. Now, this is a concept that I don't think many people have understood or have fully appreciated. But one of the things that we have been learning since March 2020 was that after all these people started to work from home, people started to experience headaches, fatigue, low mood. And psychologists who were working within organizations termed this concept of Zoom fatigue, which is the mental exhaustion associated with online video conferencing. Now, myself as a psychologist, I worked face-to-face prior to the lockdown in the UK, and then I had to quickly switch over to virtual conferencing like this. So as a therapist, I had to be very, very careful on how I was reading people's signals. Now, my sessions are usually an hour long where I'm working with people who have mental health issues. But we're talking about here, kind of academics, professionals working together, trying to have these online meetings where we're trying to flip between different screens. We're trying to read